Okay, hello folks. Welcome to another session of PHI 215. I hope everybody's doing well. So today we're continuing our unit on free will, and we are looking at libertarian theories of free will. So here's the basic rundown on what libertarians believe. So, if you're a libertarian, you believe that some of our actions are done freely. And that's because they are caused or controlled by a person or an agent. So in other words, what this means is it says that people are the ultimate causes of their actions, not external forces. So libertarians are not okay with our beliefs being caused by external forces. So they're not compatibilists like we saw last time around. But libertarians still believe that people are capable of free will. So the overall strategy for defending a libertarian view of free will is to show that compatibilism gives us the wrong theory of what it means to have free will. So the compatibilist is wrong to say that free will is compatible with a deterministic universe. So that's going to be their first strategy. But then they're going to say, we actually do have free will anyways, because our actions, as a matter of fact, are not fully determined. So what libertarians are saying is, if the universe were deterministic, then there would be no free will, right? So there they agree with hard determinists, like Baron to Holbach. But they agree with the compatibilists, people like Locke and Stace, that, we're right when we believe commonsensically that people do certain actions freely. But what they think is that the fact that people act freely shows us that our actions are not fully determined by the past and laws of nature. So the idea is libertarians disagree with compatibilists in one way, and they disagree with hard determinists in another way. So in this quick session, we're going to be looking at the approach that the libertarian takes in each strand of disagreement. So how is it that the libertarian is going to attack a compatibilist view of free will? And we're also going to look at how the libertarian attacks the hard determinist, the person who says that free will is an illusion. So we're going to see maybe some of the prospects, possibly also some of the challenges that a libertarian view of free will is going to face. So here's our first strategy for defending incompatibilism, right? So remember, libertarians are incompatibilists. So libertarians are often advance an argument called the consequence argument. So Peter van Inwagen develops a well-known version of this argument. So here's what van Inwagen says. He says, well, if determinism is true, so if the universe is deterministic such that every event is the inevitable result of the past and the laws of nature, right? That's exactly what he's saying, right? So every event has to happen because of what happened in the distant past and the laws of nature that rule over those events. Second premise, but it's not in our control to determine what the past was like or what the laws of nature were like. Whatever year you were born, the past already was what it was before you were born. And moreover, the laws of nature have always been the same. So the universe is not something that we have control over, in the sense that libertarians will actually say that we do have control over the way certain things turn out. So I just want to be clear here. What they think we don't have control over is how the past was before we were born, and we don't have control over what the laws of nature happen to be. And if it's right that we don't have control over the past or the laws of nature, and everything you ever do, if determinism is true, is the inevitable result of the past and the laws of nature, then our current actions are not up to us. So there would be no free will. So remember, what the incompatibilist like Van Inwagen is saying here is that if determinism were true, then there would be no such thing as free will. And the consequence argument is a really nice, elegant way of laying out that very worry. So here's one way of understanding this debate between compatibilists and incompatibilists. When a compatibilist talks about whether an agent could have done otherwise, they are thinking about could have done otherwise in terms of real metaphysical possibility. So they're thinking there's actually a fork in the road of possibility. So you could have gone this way or you could have gone that way, right? So it's a real indeterministic universe, and the fact of that indeterminism is what gives you the opportunity for exercising free will, right? But compatibilists, as we saw last time, told us that could have done otherwise can be read in a much different sense. So instead of metaphysical possibility, we can understand it instead simply in terms of what compatibilists will call hypothetical possibility. When we talk about hypothetical possibility, it's just the thought that, well, you did something freely such that if you had wanted to do something differently, you could have done that different thing, right? So it's like, if I wanted to, fill my fountain drink with Mr. Pibb instead of Diet Coke, which I never want to do, then I could have done it. But compatibilists, unlike incompatibilists, don't really care what causes you to have the desires that you have, or how predictably your desires lead to your actions. So the consequence argument gives us the first step in the libertarian strategy for defending their approach to free will. So the first step is to establish the falsity of compatibilism and the truth of incompatibilism. So the first thing that they're going to want to do, and through the consequence argument, they try to show exactly this, that compatibilism couldn't be true. Because remember, if determinism is really true, then everything you ever do is fixed before you're ever born. So nothing is really up to you, right? So that would show the falsity of compatibilism and the truth of incompatibilism. Remember, those are just views about whether determinism is compatible with free will. Now we can come to the second strategy. So the second thing that the libertarian has to do is they have to show us that there's good reason to believe that human agency is not deterministic. So the thought is that when we're talking about actions that are freely done, those are things that are not necessarily things that would have been done in this strong metaphysical sense. It's literally true that when you do an action freely, you could have done otherwise, right? So, if it's a matter of taking a sip of water or jumping over a fence or handing in a term paper, the libertarian is going to say that, yeah, the reason why you do those things freely when you do them freely is because it's literally true that doing the other thing was a real possibility, and that you, as an agent, caused a particular course of action to materialize. So we might think about how these different views might differ from each other. So we can look at this first question, right? Do people act freely? Are we talking about something real when we talk about free will? Well, compatibilists say, yeah, there's such thing as free actions, and libertarians say, yeah, there's such thing as free actions. Right? Now, hard determinists, Vaughan refers to them as free will skeptics in a couple of places in the book, says that these people, like de Holbach, say, no, there's actually no such thing as free will. Right? It's an illusion. Right? And the reason why hard determinists think that free will is an illusion is because they think that the universe is deterministic, and they think that determinism is incompatible with free will, right? So if you say the universe is deterministic and free will is incompatible with determinism, then you're going to have to say that no, people do not act freely, right? Compatibilists, on the other hand, say, yeah, the universe is deterministic, but free will and determinism are compatible, so we believe that people do act freely, right? The approach that the libertarian takes is to say, compatibilism is false. If the universe were deterministic, the hard determinist would be right. They would be right to say that there's no such thing as free will. But hey, guess what? Good news. Determinism is false. It really is possible that when you exercise your agency, you really could have done otherwise. Right? So people act freely, but it's because human actions are not determined by the previous state of the universe and the laws of nature. So, in that spirit, the libertarian is going to develop for us a view that's known as agent causation. So, agent causation, as defended by Richard Taylor in your textbook, suggests, like, yeah, you know what? It really is the case that human actions are not determined by the laws of nature. And he says the best evidence for this claim comes from your very own experience, right? When you're making a choice, you often feel like both things that you might do are real options, right? You might imagine, say, if you have an offer letter from 2 colleges that you're interested in going to, it's a real possibility that you go to one school, and it's a real possibility that you could go to the other, right? So there really are alternative courses of actions, and it really is up to you in this incompatibilist sense, right? That your choosing actually makes a difference. So it's genuinely and ultimately up to yourself. Like which school you go to, or who you decide to marry, or what kind of career you choose. So when we start taking this view right down to it, it's basically saying that your free actions are separate from the laws of nature, right? The laws of nature are not making you do what you do. So Taylor says, this might raise an interesting question about whether every libertarian about free will has to say this. But here's what Taylor says. He says that libertarian free will, it depends on the idea that selves or persons are self-moving entities, right? Because if they were moved by something external, then we'd be treating agency as something that's caused by an outside force, right? We might wonder about that. Have you ever seen something move itself? Like you've seen, like a dog get out of bed or a bird begin to fly. But we realize that, that bird had to eat some food or the dog had to eat some food and find external motivation to get moving in the world. Right? So you might think that that kind of self-motion isn't enough for libertarian free will. To be a self-moving entity is to be this thing unto itself that can be the ultimate cause of certain events. So here, again, this is how Richard Taylor puts it in his defense of libertarianism. He says that agents are substances, but not events. And within this view, an agent can initiate or perform an action that was not necessarily going to happen. So when you choose to go to, the one school of your choice, that you decide to go to App State instead of UNC Wilmington once you finish your associate's degree, the idea is that you can perform an action of accepting an offer at App State. That's a thing that was not necessarily going to happen. And Taylor seems to think that the only way that you can say that you can do this thing that wasn't necessarily going to happen is to treat yourself as a self-moving entity, right? So it's sort of like you're bringing yourself up out of nothing, like in this M.C. Escher drawing hands, right? Where it seems like the drawer is bringing itself into existence, but the thing, it seems like they're both bringing themselves into existence, so it's like a single self-causing entity. And that's weird, right? Most effects have causes which were effects prior in time. So this leads us to some interesting challenges that might emerge for theories of agent causation. So one challenge that we might see is that it seems to involve a kind of dualism about the mind, substance dualism, much like the version of the theory of mind that Descartes proposed, that the mind and the body are two separate things, and that minds aren't really subject to the laws of physics. But we'll remember when we were working on philosophy of mind that it then becomes rather inexplicable for the substance dualist to explain how the mind and the body, how mental substance and material substance are actually capable of interacting with one another. So yeah, we then start to wonder these things like, okay, so if every effect has a prior cause, we then start to wonder, well, how is it that an agent can cause an event without itself being an object or an event? Which Taylor, on sort of like a classic view of agent causation, straightforwardly denies. And we might also start wondering, you might recall Galen Strawson's suggestion from when we were looking at hard determinism, the thought that if we're saying that we have freedom because our acts are uncaused, well, we might start to worry a whole lot that if we're trying to claim that our actions are free because they're not determined, then there's something random about our actions, and that's not at all sufficient for genuine choice. It kind of seems like chance is the opposite of choice. Flipping a coin isn't free will, right? Now, other libertarian philosophers like Timothy O'Connor have said that agents have volition-enabling properties that allow people to make choices that were not determined by previous events. So, again, the libertarian could still work on defending this view. And if you're persuaded by this libertarian viewpoint, you might think it's a worthwhile project to try to think through how it is that our minds, which are separate from the material world, have properties that can allow people to make choices and have an effect on the world that's somehow outside of, or at least not determined by the way that the material physical world is. So, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about Friedrich Nietzsche. He hasn't shown up this semester yet, and he's a fun character to have around during an Intro to Philosophy course. So, let's hear what Nietzsche has to say about libertarianism, and in particular, this idea of agent causation. So Nietzsche says this. Nietzsche's a pretty interesting writer, but let's work through this chunk of text. Nietzsche says, "The causa sui is the best self-contradiction that has yet been conceived. It is sort of a logical violation and unnaturalness." So he seems to be saying that the idea of a self-moving agent is, if not illogical, then kind of incoherent or unnatural, or we might say an abomination. He says, "But the extravagant pride of man has managed to entangle itself profoundly and frightfully with this very folly. The desire for such a freedom of will in the superlative metaphysical sense," so remember this sort of indeterministic, self-causing, outside the laws of nature sense, "still holds sway. Unfortunately, in the minds of the half-educated, the desire to bear the entire and ultimate responsibility for one's actions oneself, and to absolve God, the world, ancestors, chance, and the society therefrom, involves nothing less than to be precisely this causa sui." So a causa sui is just something that is out of nothing, right? Sort of like a self-causing being, right? So he's saying that, in order to believe in free will, you have to flatter yourself enough to think that your actions are ultimately up to you and that they have nothing to do with God, the world, ancestors, chance, society, and so forth, right? So you believe yourself to be completely causa sui. And that's the idea, this self-causing agent that Nietzsche finds to be so incoherent. He then goes on to say, "And with more than Munchausen daring to pull oneself up into existence by the hair out of the slough of nothingness." So he's making an interesting literary allusion here to Baron Munchausen. So he's a character in 17th or 18th century British literature. But the idea here is to think of something as a self-causing agent is to think about Munchausen here, stuck in a swamp, And the way that this sort of fanciful story goes is that Munchausen saves the day by pulling himself out of the swamp by his own hair. Get it? Of course, no matter how hard you pull on your own hair, when you're stuck in the swamp, you can't pull yourself out of nothingness. But Nietzsche seems to think that that's precisely what a libertarian theory of agent causation says that it's actually achieving. And that this is that sort of perversion of logic that Nietzsche sees and diagnoses in a libertarian theory. But on the other hand, we might think that there's something to like about a libertarian theory, right? There does seem to be something worrying about the thought that the universe is deterministic. And in that way, it seems like incompatibilism has something to say for it. That there is something at least plausible about the idea of incompatibilism. And moreover, when we do make choices, just like the principle of credulity that we learned about in the context of the philosophy of religion, well, in free will debates, it makes sense too, right? Because Taylor says, look, experience gives us a good reason to believe in free will, right? When you decide what college to study at, it seems like both the options are genuinely up to you, and that the laws of nature aren't forcing you to do one thing or the other. And if you get into that mindset, you might think that maybe these objections to say that, well, self-causing events are puzzling, or if we get to Nietzsche's version of the objection that says that self-caused events are incoherent, maybe as someone persuaded by libertarianism, you might be able to find a way to spell this out further. And again, I invited you a little earlier to think about maybe whether we could think of a version of libertarianism and agent causation that does not depend on substance dualism. Now, Richard Taylor, one libertarian, thinks that you're going to need substance dualism in order to make sense of agent causation and ultimately free will. But maybe you might have a version of libertarianism that might be compatible with a materialistic version of philosophy of mind that says that there's only one kind of substance, and that's material substance. So, just to sum up, remember, libertarianism is the view that we have free will because we are capable of agent causation, right? So if we think about that chart that we were looking at, libertarianism is the view that we do have free will, even though compatibilism is false and incompatibilism is true. And we also saw that, because all libertarians are incompatibilists, many of them are going to defend incompatibilism through this consequence argument from Peter van Inwagen, which says that, if the past and the laws of nature are up to you and the universe is deterministic, then nothing could really be genuinely up to you. And then we saw that agent causation is the view that agents can bring about events that weren't necessarily going to happen, that were not determined by the laws of nature in the previous state of the universe. We saw that many defenses of agent causation are going to appeal to contentious and challengeable views about the nature of the human self and about how causation works. For instance, the claim that an uncaused entity could have a causal influence on the material world by initiating an action, even though it was not necessarily going to happen. So that wraps it up for this time around. Thanks for listening in, and do make sure to go to Moodle and finish up your quiz. And in the meantime, if any questions or concerns arise, don't hesitate to send me an email. And I hope I'll get to hear from you soon during one of the Zoom meetings. I'll look forward to hearing what your thinking is about these fascinating issues in debates about free will, compatibilism, and agent causation. So thanks again, and take care, everybody.